She stood at the front of the classroom. He sat in the third row, watching her. He was 15 years old. She was 39, married, with 3 children, and a life that looked completely respectable from the outside. His parents found out, and they panicked. They pulled him out of school and sent him far away. They thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Her husband found out the full truth, not the rumors, not the whispers, but everything. And what he did next is something almost no one knows. Before this video ends, you will find out what this woman said something to a teenage boy's mother that left her completely speechless. You will find out what secret Macron has never publicly explained. And you will find out what happened behind closed doors that the French press buried for years. This is not a love story, and the truth is far stranger than what you've been told. To find out more, let's dive into Empire Elegance. In the early 1990s, in the northern French city of Amiens, a 15-year-old boy walked into a drama class and sat down in front of a woman who would change the entire direction of his life. His name was Emmanuel Macron. Her name was Brigitte Ozier. She was his teacher. She was also someone else's wife. Emmanuel was not an ordinary teenager. Those who knew him describe a boy who was intellectually ferocious, emotionally intense, and unnervingly self-possessed for his age. He didn't just participate in class, he dominated it. He didn't just admire his teacher, he studied her. And Brigitte noticed. The two began working together on a school play. On paper, it was entirely professional, a teacher mentoring a gifted student. Behind the scenes, something else was forming, something that the adults around them could feel but couldn't quite name. Here is what nobody tells you about this period. It wasn't just Emmanuel who was drawn in. The question of who pursued whom, and when it truly began, is one that France has never fully answered. And the reason it hasn't been answered will become very clear before this video ends. When Jean-Michel Macron and Françoise Noguez began to understand what was happening between their teenage son and his drama teacher, they did not wait. They went directly to Brigitte. They sat across from the woman who was supposed to be educating their child. What Brigitte said to Emmanuel's mother in that conversation is something that has surfaced only in fragments over the years. But one line, reportedly spoken directly, stopped the room cold. She told his mother, "I don't know if I'll manage to stop myself from falling in love with your son." Read that again. This was not a student confessing feelings to a teacher. This was the teacher, the adult, the married woman, the mother of 3, telling a teenage boy's mother that she could not promise to stay away from him. His parents pulled Emmanuel out of the school immediately. They sent him to Paris, to one of the most elite schools in France, hundreds of miles away from Amiens, hundreds of miles away from Brigitte. They believed it was over. Emmanuel made a promise before he left. He told Brigitte he would come back for her. He was 15 years old. And now, here is the part that should make you stop and think, because the story everyone tells ends here, with a teenage promise that sounds almost romantic. What the story doesn't tell you is what was happening on the other side of that marriage while all of this was unfolding. André-Louis Ozier was not a public figure. He was a banker, a private man, a husband and father who had built a stable, respected life in Amiens, alongside his wife of many years. He had 3 children with Brigitte, a home, a future that looked settled. He had no idea what was already in motion. By the time André-Louis understood the full reality, not fragments, not rumors, but the complete picture of what had been happening inside his marriage, Brigitte had already made her decision. And what he did next is the part of this story that almost no one talks about. He did not go to the press. He did not hire a lawyer to destroy her reputation. What André-Louis Ozier did was far more calculated than rage and far more painful than silence alone. He disappeared. Completely, deliberately, permanently. He agreed to the divorce. He stepped away from the public narrative, and he constructed a wall of privacy around himself so impenetrable that to this day, even with his ex-wife living in the Élysée Palace as First Lady of France, he has never spoken publicly about any of it. Not one interview, not one statement, not one word. The answer to that question reveals something about this story that the polished version, the one France prefers to tell, has never acknowledged. After Paris, after the distance, after everything his parents had done to end it, He returned to Brigitte. He was no longer 15, but the connection that had formed in that classroom had not dissolved. If anything, the separation had deepened it. Brigitte ended her marriage. She dismantled the life she had built in Amiens, the home, the social standing, the identity of a respectable wife in a conservative French city, and she walked away from it. People who knew Brigitte during this period describe a woman who was not impulsive, not swept up in something she didn't understand. She was deliberate. She knew exactly what she was losing, and she chose to lose it anyway. That choice is either the most romantic thing you've ever heard, or it is something else entirely, depending on how old you were when you first became aware of how this story began. Emmanuel has never wavered in his account. He has said publicly and repeatedly that Brigitte is the love of his life. He has never expressed doubt, never apologized, never softened the edges of how it started. That certainty is striking, because most people, looking back at something that began when they were 15, would at minimum acknowledge the complexity. Macron never does, and that refusal to acknowledge it is one of the quietest, most telling details in this entire story. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron became president of France at 39 years old. Brigitte stood beside him at the Élysée Palace. She was 63. The world looked at the age gap and reacted, but most of that reaction focused on the surface, the years between them, the optics. What the world largely failed to examine was the origin, because once you put a man in the presidency, the story of how his relationship began stops being a personal matter and becomes something the public has a stake in. Critics, not tabloids but serious commentators, began asking what should have been asked long before. What exactly happened in that classroom, and when? If the genders were reversed, if a 39-year-old male teacher had told a 15-year-old girl's mother that he couldn't promise not to fall in love with her, what would the consequences have been? Why did the school not intervene? Why did French institutions, the press, and the political establishment collectively agree to treat this as a charming eccentricity rather than examine it with the same standards applied to anyone else? These questions have no clean answers. Even with Macron leading one of the most powerful democracies on earth, tells you something important about how power protects its own story. Brigitte Macron is one of the most visible first ladies in the world. She attends policy meetings. She speaks on education reform. She is photographed, interviewed, and analyzed constantly. She has spoken about her marriage with complete composure. She calls it the defining relationship of her life. She has acknowledged it was unconventional. She has never framed it as something that required an apology. Her first husband, André Louis, remarried quietly. He lives outside the public eye. His children, Brigitte's children, have stayed close to their mother. Tiffaine, the youngest, has been openly supportive of both Brigitte and Macron, which adds its own complexity to a family story that was never simple. André Louis himself remains a ghost in this narrative, present enough to have existed, invisible enough to have never had to explain himself. And that silence, his silence, maintained for decades, is the most powerful statement anyone in this story has ever made. Because silence from a man who had every reason to speak is not emptiness. It is a choice, and choices, in stories like this one, always mean something. Here is what we know for certain. A teenage boy sat in a classroom and decided he wanted his teacher. A married woman told that boy's mother she couldn't promise to stay away from him. A husband found out, said nothing, and disappeared from history. And the boy grew up to run France. Whether this is the greatest love story of modern European politics, or one of its most uncomfortable, untold scandals, depends entirely on which facts you're willing to hold in your hand at the same time. Empire Elegance holds all of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Empire Elegance, and hit the notification bell for more powerful stories about the lives and legacies of the world's most influential families. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.